International trade will be an important test of leadership for the new U.S. president. On one hand, U.S. interests in international trade have perhaps never been greater. 75% of global purchasing power and 95% of the world's consumers now reside beyond U.S. borders. With U.S. consumer spending still sluggish, it will need to be international trade and access with these fast-growing developing country markets that drives U.S. economic and employment growth in the future. On the other hand, however, U.S. popular and political support for the initiatives needed to take advantage of these trade opportunities has perhaps never been lower. Recent surveys have shown that Americans, a plurality of Americans now believe free trade agreements hurt the United States. Deep political divisions around labor rights and environmental protections and intellectual property continue to bedevil U.S. trade policy. It took 5 years to pass the 3 most recent U.S. free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. President Obama is likely to be the rare U.S. president to have operated for his entire term without trade promotion authority to negotiate and conclude trade agreements with limited interference from Congress. While the U.S. has been stymied on international trade investment, its economic rivals have not. Bilateral and regional trade agreements that exclude the U.S. are proliferating, and it's U.S. companies that are paying the price with less favorable treatment for their goods, services, and investments. The new U.S. president will have 3 important opportunities to exercise leadership on trade and to make progress. The first will be the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks. When these talks were launched in 2009, they received little fanfare. Now some are comparing them to NATO and the Marshall Plan in terms of their potential economic and strategic significance. When taken together, the 8 other countries involved in the TPP would be the U.S.'s 4th largest trading partner and represent 25% of global economic output. If Japan joins the talks, TPP countries would be the U.S.'s 2nd largest trading partner and represent 36% of global GDP. With Canada, Mexico, and other Latin American countries considering joining, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a potential regional platform for trade and investment in the important Asia-Pacific region for years to come. The challenge will be that people are uncertain whether the U.S. will be able to conclude and enact this agreement due to political divisions in the U.S. around trade policy. The second opportunity for the president to exercise leadership on trade will be with regard to China and trade enforcement. The new U.S. president will have to walk a fine line between fulfilling campaign promises to level the playing field for U.S. investors and companies, while still avoiding a trade war with China in the midst of an economic recovery that's still fragile after the recession. The need to incorporate alternatives to dispute resolution are only greater because the U.S.'s big challenges with China are on issues like subsidies, preferential procurement policies, and state ownership of Chinese enterprises, all issues on which there are limited WTO tools. Which leads us to the third and last important opportunity for the U.S. president on international trade, and that is at the World Trade Organization. The Doha Development Agenda, the most recent negotiation round at the WTO, is now in its 2nd decade and stalled. The new U.S. president is going to have to find ways to make progress at the WTO, even if these involve more modest sectoral initiatives or reforms to the dispute resolution process. The United States has significant interests in a vibrant, relevant WTO as a guarantor of a rules-based global trading system. So in sum, the new U.S. president takes office at a moment of significant crossroads for U.S. engagement on international trade. There are significant challenges with China and liberalization at the WTO, but also tremendous opportunities, such as at the TPP. The new U.S. president is going to have to spend political capital early and personally to convince Congress and the public of the benefits of free trade. U.S. trade officials will also have to be ingenious in identifying new ways to ensure those benefits are tangible and go beyond the diffuse economic gains of U.S. trade agreements past.